You're watching Linking History, and today we're looking at the Indians who arrived as convicts and servants in the late 1700s and early 1800s, believed to be the first Indians in Australia. Australia was colonised during when the British East India Company were active, and many of the ships that arrived here came from Calcutta, the capital of British India at the time. Alongside the convicts arriving from Britain were Indian convicts, who would serve sentences longer than 7 years through hard labour. Ships departing India also had Lascars, or Indian sailors, working on board. 42 Lascars were on board the famous Sydney Cove, a merchant ship that departed from Calcutta in 1796 but got shipwrecked off the coast of Tasmania. The 17 survivors of the wreck, including 12 Bengali Lascars, took a longboat over the Bass Strait but then got shipwrecked again on 90 Mile Beach. They had to walk 700 kilometres to Sydney, aided by some amused Indigenous guides, and in the end, only 3 men survived. Many Indians also arrived as servants to wealthy British landowners.
Probably the most famous Indian servant was George Jarvis, brought to Australia in 1809 by New South Wales Governor Lachlan Macquarie.
In 1795, George Jarvis and another boy named Hector were purchased from a Cochin slave market for 170 rupees. Macquarie wrote in his diary that they were very fine, well-looking, healthy black boys who were between 6 and 7 years old. Hector escaped somewhere in Cochin, but George Jarvis stayed with Macquarie for the rest of his life as his manservant and valet. We'll never hear George's perspective. Everything we know about him comes from Macquarie and his contemporaries' accounts. On the one hand, George was seen as a black Hindu servant, but Macquarie left him enough money in his will to marry and live comfortably. Therefore, it's hard to say whether their relationship was amicable, as some academics have suggested. Meanwhile, Sydney landowner William Brown is famous for the almost 40 servants he brought over on various journeys in the early 1800s. Brown wrote in his diaries of their mild and submissive manner, and notably their willingness to tolerate low provisions and low wages. But in the middle of 1819, 22 of his servants testified in court to being beaten, starved, denied wages, and threatened by the Browns. The testimonies revealed that 2 women lost their children being forced to work, and Miss Sophia Brown, his wife, who had convinced many of the workers to sign on, enjoyed taunting and physically assaulting them. The magistrate found in favour of all the workers, and all 40 of them were sent back to India. But despite the rulings, the Browns continued to keep servants in their later years. Indian convict and servant labour was instrumental in the development of Australia's colonies, but it's a contribution that's been largely overlooked. There's information about the Indians who came here as cameleers and traders, and even those who fought in the wars, but no exact numbers for how many were transported here as servants. Ship registers usually listed them as others, gave them aliases, or didn't record them at all. Despite being colonised subjects of the British Empire themselves, it's also important to understand where Indian servants and convicts sit within the colonisation of Australia. Sure, they weren't willingly brought to Australia, but they were still complicit in benefiting from Indigenous dispossession and suffering by serving the colony. What's more, Indian servants still had some power under the law to speak up against their masters, which is more than what Indigenous Australians had to speak up about the pain inflicted on them. Let's also consider where slavery factors in. All of this happened between the British Slave Trade Act of 1807 and the Indian Indentured Labour System of 1834. The British were moving away from slavery, but were finding legal and moral loopholes to source cheap labour in its place. Though not formally recognised as slaves, Indian servants and convicts were transported far away from their home, often against their will, and sometimes, in the words of William Brown's servants, treated no better than slaves. It's tempting to make judgments based on whether they were treated well or not, but ultimately the power balance between their Indian servants and their masters wasn't equal. Either way, the involvement of these forgotten Indian servants in Australia's colonies shows us that our country's history is far more complex than we'd initially imagined. Thanks for watching Linking History. Join us next time when we talk about the indentured labourers transported across the Indian Ocean.